O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasurer of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls, O good one.
Amen.
Amen. So does anybody have any reflections on last week?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm quoting the same passage I was just talking about. It was 21. Yeah. I don't know. It's just mostly you try to make sense of where he says, "Some people living carelessly in the world have asked me, we have wives who are in the social cares, people lead a solitary life, they list all the things of, well, here's what you can do." But the verbiage in the beginning and the end is a little, does it mean in the original, what is he writing in Greek, I guess? Yeah. I mean, some people living carelessly in the world have asked. So is he like equating living carelessly in the world to having a wife and social obligations and things like that? Or
He might be.
Okay.
Is this last one or this one?
Last one.
You realize, I mean, he's a monk writing to monks, and I don't know what the Greek actually says, but he could be saying people who are living carefree in the world,
Right.
which has a whole different connotation than carelessly.
Right.
So
there are a couple different ways to read that. I mean, I'm tempted to read it as, there are people who, it kind of insinuates that those who are not living carelessly are already doing these things too. So
Oh yeah.
whether or not they're monastics.
Right.
I was wondering if that's correct.
Well, yeah. I mean, actually, if you're not living carelessly in the world, if you're married and have a family, you would be doing, and you're a really dedicated Christian, you'd be doing all these things. Yeah. Which is basically follow the commandments and go to church.
Right.
But
the other thing that grabbed my attention, he says, if you behave this way, you will not be far from the kingdom of heaven. Is he just using poetic language there, or is he?
Well, he's quoting Christ.
Okay.
That because somewhere in the gospel says that Christ said something like that. I think.
Does that mean that? I mean that again insinuates that you don't have the kingdom if you're not far from it.
No, I think it's just poetic. What else?
I guess it's going to be a challenge, reading on detachment. Separating yourself from your family, and for those of us that have a family, it seems so much of monasticism can be self-absorbed, as opposed to, I spend 10 times more time in prayer for my family than I do for me. And I'm sure most fathers do that. And the idea that you should somehow detach yourself, or...
Well, the idea of detachment...
A monk does, he forsakes everything.
Yeah.
But we need to translate this.
Right.
Maybe that's part of what...
Right, and that's the whole point of this class,
Yeah.
is to translate it. So detachment has, there are multiple levels to it. One is to do like the more radical monks and just leave everything and go off into the desert, and that's one thing. But it's a completely, for those of us who are living in the world, monk or not like me, is to do, it's a kind of, it's more of an orientation. How are you regarding all of these things? I mean, are you dependent on them? Are they a greater care and love for you than God? Are you more attached to these things of the world, to these people, to these relationships than you are to God?
Maybe you're more attached to them than you are to yourself.
And maybe you are. But are you more attached to yourself and means your own ego than you are to God? And so detachment is a kind of inner It's an inner attitude, an inner orientation towards things where we need to put God first and foremost above all things and all relationships and all people. And when we do that, what we're doing is we're reordering our relationships. Now, in the monastery, I mean, obviously there's relationships and there's stuff, and you have possessions, and you've got a position, and you've got rank, and you've got all these things, and you can be just as attached to all of that stuff as somebody in the world, who has a job and who has a salary and he's got a family and he's got a house and he's got a car and he's got a sports car and he's got a girlfriend, and all this other stuff. And what's the, and so it's about the inner attitude towards these things. Because what's the difference between somebody who's living carelessly in the world and a monk who's living carelessly in the monastery? Well, the monk who's living carelessly in the monastery, who's made a vow to detach from all of this stuff and is not doing it, is actually in worse shape than the guy who's living in the world, who's just kind of oblivious to all this spiritual stuff. Because the monk should know better. And if he chooses to ignore it, then that's even worse. And if he chooses to defy God and defy the gospel, then that's really bad. Whereas the guy who's living in the world simply is following his passions and doesn't know his right hand from his left.
So what it appears that, my understanding so far is that there are two ways to really achieve or get close to the kingdom of God. Is you can choose to do the monastic way of life.
Right.
You can choose to do the family, the worldly way of life.
Mm-hmm.
But the task is by denying yourself. The way I understand is, I deny my ego. I deny my false self.
Right.
While I'm maintaining my relationships with the world around me, regardless.
Right.
Like Christ did. I mean,
Right.
He was in the world having relationships.
Exactly.
But he wasn't. That wasn't his commitment. That wasn't what he was.
And he wasn't defined by those relationships.
Right. So it's really by denying and the detachment is detached from your false self and ego, while really live God in Christ's life wherever you are.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's what I'm hearing. Is
Right.
that right?
Right. And of course, what the Christian life is about is living in communion with God here and now. So if you spend your entire life worrying about how much money you're going to make and what kind of position you're going to achieve in your company or whatever, or if you spend your entire life worrying about what's a good monastic thing to worry about, whether so-and-so is going to get into the position that I really want, and and why is he doing that, and what's he doing to manipulate things, and you're off. If that's the kind of thing you're into, you're off base and need to repent and reorder things so that God is first and everything takes its position, takes its ranking, as it were, in relationship to God and a commitment to God. So and it's the same in family life as it is in monastic life. Only in family life, you have a wife and children. In monastic life, you've got an abbot and brothers, or abbess and sisters. They're both kinds of families. You've got a natural family or a spiritual family. So monasticism is the Christian alternative lifestyle. And the natural, and the natural family is the normal Christian lifestyle. Because monasticism is really not, it's not for everybody. It's only for those who are called and who say yes and who choose it. There are a variety of things that happen in that was dealt with a little bit in chapter 1. But it's really all about it's a life in which that pursuit of the spiritual life is first and foremost, and everything takes second place to that. And it's hard to do that when you're trying to support a family, you're trying to support your wife and kids and have a job and pay the bills and all of that other stuff. Whereas in the monastery, where everything is communal, the average monk doesn't have to worry about who pays the bills, who's bringing in the income. Everybody contributes, by their work. But it's a life generally free from those kinds of material cares, so that it can be devoted to the services and to the work of the monastery. And so there's a big difference between the two. Whereas family life,
Sounds like a family.
well, it is like
either
family.
the abbot has to worry about it, or the economos, if she's the one who's going to take it over.
The abbot, yeah.
everyone contributes.
One of the great elders of Elder Kirill, who actually had a big influence in my life. He was the great elder of the Russian Church coming out of the Soviet period. He had 10,000 monks, 100 men's monasteries under his spiritual direction. And he would say that those in monastic administration give up having a spiritual life so others can have one. And that's really true, to a great degree. Now, you gotta have a spiritual life, but you can't focus on it like you can if you're a monk under obedience.
So those that serve in church can enjoy can immerse themselves in the atmosphere like the people that are just standing there.
Yeah, it's a great, it's a
keep track. Do I light it now? Do I light it later?
Yeah. Or if you're the priest or the bishop, you're standing in liturgy and what's he doing now? Why is he standing over there? Oh my God, he's going to light a fire. Oh, that kid is about to set the whole church on fire.
Father Alexander would say you give up something when you're in the altar because you've got all this stuff going on. To stand there quietly and worship, which is a privilege. Yeah, you got kids to come out and go.
That's why we have deacons and sub-deacons to worry about all that, right?
Yes. It's
Uh-huh.
the deacon's kids that usually cause the problems.
How does the parish fit in this? Because so far we have a dichotomy. We have a family life and monastic life. What about the parish community?
Well, that's an important question, and a monastery is a consecrated community. It's consecrated by the service of tonsure, as monks commit themselves or nuns commit themselves to that particular community, which is equivalent
The marriage.
to a marriage. Now, there are two kinds of consecrated communities in the church. What's the other one?
Is it the family?
Marriage. Marriage. And what's consecrated? The fatherhood in the monastery. It's the abbot. Abbot means father. Abba means father. In the family, we've got consecrated fatherhood. He said, Chandler, the kid who came, that he can come here and he can exult in his toxic masculinity. and the church, the Russian, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, but the Orthodox Church is the ultimate patriarchal organization, and we're proud of it. and we ain't changing. But it's precisely when patriarchy works, and when you see it working in, especially you see it working in the church, when you have healthy families, and that doesn't mean that the wife in submission to her husband. That doesn't mean that the wife is dominated by her husband, but the wife is
obedience to Christ.
in obedience to Christ, in cooperation, because synergy is the essence of all of our theology, right? You talk about Christ being in synergy with the Father's will, the divine will, and the human will in Christ. You talk about salvation as the synergy between our will and God's will. You talk about the church as cooperation with one another, synergy in the will of God. Everything is about synergy. And so what is obedience? Obedience is about synergy. It's about love and respect. It's cooperation out of love and respect. That's what obedience is. It's not about you better do that or you're going to get hit, or you're going to get sent to your room, or you're not going to get what you know. That's not about any of that stuff. It's about cooperation out of love. And the other kinds of obedience out of fear, or obedience out of fear of not being rewarded what you're due, are immature, are very immature. If you've got people that think like that, you have to deal with that. But they're not going to get very far, quite frankly, especially in monastic life. Because that only lasts so long, and then they're going to rebel, or they'll grow out of it, hopefully. And so, in the monastery, which is built around the sacrament of obedience, the obedience becomes sacramental, because obedience to the spiritual father becomes a participation in. It's offered as obedience to Christ. Now, that's in a monastery. In the parish, that does not work. And that's not how it goes. Because you have families in the parish, and you have sacred communities which are structured by obedience, right? So you've got to have obedience in the household. And what is the task of the priest in the parish is not to be putting people under obedience and holding them accountable for their obedience, except in a very few areas. Number one, whether you should go to communion or not after you've committed a big sin, which is the main one, but that's really, and organizing parish life and things like that. But the priest in a parish cannot be in a position in which he controls people's lives. That's absolutely wrong. Categorically and completely wrong.
It's like a cult.
It's a cult. And there are some churches that have turned into cults. And we have to definitively reject that, because it's not about control. It's about trying to create a synergy which comes out of the mutual cooperation and agreement of all of these various people, with the fathers of the families and their families, and everybody working together for a common vision and a common goal. And that's what a parish is. In other words, a parish is a collection of these sacred consecrated communities.
Like a federation.
Yeah, and that are coming together for the common goal of building a beautiful church for God, and not just the buildings, but the community and all of that. And it's the priest's role, being the father of a family himself, for the most part, his role is to support the other married communities, married families, marriages and families. And so it's a very different kind of structure than a monastery. In a monastery, the monk pledges obedience to the abbot, who is his spiritual father, and is accountable for that obedience. In a parish, there's a, it's much more by agreement. We come together, we make mutual decisions. The priest is not a dictator. He can't be a dictator. Bishop can't be a dictator. But
Actually,
it's
I know,
fostering mutual
know
agreement.
cases where the priest is actually put in a like a subservient role to the parish council.
Right, and that's also off.
And really terrible because he's terrified for his livelihood because somebody doesn't like him because of whatever reason.
Well, that's the Protestant model. Unfortunately, in many of the churches, many of the Orthodox churches in this country, because they were incorporated using Protestant church models in the legal system, they have that written into their bylaws. And in fact, for the most part, the Greek Archdiocese, for example, the priest is simply the priest is not the president of the parish. He's not the president of the parish council. He's an employee of the parish council, and he has no say on the parish council. The priest only has jurisdiction within the altar.
Is putting jurisdiction above spiritual relationship, isn't that wrong? I mean, shouldn't the parish council be?
Well, every church I've seen that follows it is sick.
The what?
I said every church I've seen that does that is sick.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is. It is not. It's not the Orthodox model, and it's not an organic model. The ancient practice of choosing a man to be the priest from within the community is because he is a senior member of the community who has the respect of the community and essentially functions as the elder within that community. And not elder in the Starets sense, but elder in the sense that he's the senior person who has the wisdom to guide and to keep things together. And people go to him, with their problems, and they go for him to him for guidance, and and he works with them to set the vision and accomplish. And so it's very natural that the priest should be the president of the community, the one who presides at the Eucharist, the president of the Eucharist. That's what, if there's a bishop, the bishop by seniority presides at the Eucharist. I mean, if I can be so bold, I think we have a pretty healthy community here. I mean, extraordinarily so.
And I've often wondered if it's our backgrounds, military, law enforcement.
I think so, absolutely.
Hierarchy, and
I'm a man under authority. I tell him to.
Where does it come? The whole thing seems backwards, because if you read the book of Acts, the New Testament, they're always sent. Christ sent the apostles, ordained the deacons,
the
they're
priests.
sent. The communities don't just elect.
Well, that's in the New Testament.
I'm yet to find it in the New Testament where a community just hired a priest.
You don't. You don't find it there because it didn't exist yet. Okay, you got to go to chapter 2. And so, if it's really interesting to see how it all evolved, because in the New Testament you have the apostles, you still have the apostles, And the apostles, the thing that characterizes the apostles is that they're on the move. And in the Didache, which is contemporaneous with the New Testament, it said if an apostle stays in one place more than 3 days, he's not a true apostle. But the apostles established bishops, overseers, and presbyters, elders and deacons in the local communities who would stay put and who would manage and so they were chosen from within the community. They didn't bring people from outside. They didn't wait for the next class from seminary because there was none.
But the apostles they basically sent those people to do this work.
Yeah, the apostles designated people in each community to become the bishop and the priests, presbyters. The word presbyter means elder, or it means old man, actually, elder. The word presbyter is the Greek, presbyteros is the Greek term.
Presbyopia.
In Old English, the word came into English as prester, Old German English, and it was shortened in later English to priest. So when you say priest, the word that it refers to in the New Testament is presbyter. Now at first there was no distinction between presbyters and bishops, but that evolved by the year 100. So the early church, things evolved, and so the bishop was the high priest of that community. He had with him his board of elders. Essentially, the senior men in the parish were ordained as presbyters, elders, but they didn't serve the liturgy. The liturgy was served by the bishop and the deacons, and still today you can see that unless the bishop tells the priest to give communion, the priest basically just stands there and looks pretty. Think about it. And he may get a line or two.
But that's only if the bishop gives it to you.
That's right. Seriously.
Right.
And if you have a big hierarchical celebration, there are 12 lines actually that can be given to the priest. If you have 12 priests, each one only gets one line. And for that they're standing there in these hot vestments for all this time, and all the rest of it's going on between the bishop and the deacon and the choir. So priests didn't get assigned. Parishes actually were not created until the 4th or 5th century, because earlier on, up through the 4th century, all the Christians in each city would go to one church, and that's where the bishop was, and the bishop with the priests and the deacons and all the faithful of that city, all the Christians of that city. And you can imagine by the 4th or 5th century that got to be a lot of people, so they had to create other churches, and they didn't want to put bishops in all these other suburban churches, so they sent presbyters out. And it's a long history, but the presbyters are designated by the bishop to serve a particular parish. But very often that is a response to the request of the parish itself to the bishop to put a certain priest there, or they may just ask for a priest. But once the priest is in the parish, the priest he's the president of the parish. He's the father of the parish. In the place of the bishop, he's the bishop's designated deputy, essentially. A priest's authority is limited. He can't ordain. He can't. There's a lot of there are things priests cannot do that bishops can. But as as time went on, the number of bishops decreased and the number of priests heading up parishes increased. And so and so we've had the current model now for about 1,500 years, give or take, and so it kind of works.
If our word priest comes from presbytery, what is the Old Testament word for priest?
In Greek, it's hieros, sanctifier, and it also implies somebody who offers sacrifice. So, the bishop is archieros, high priest. And so the two come together. So Christ is as the archieros, Christ is the great high priest, is the one who sanctifies things by his sacrifice, his self-sacrifice, and then returning again that his body, which had been offered to the Father, to us as food in the form of bread and wine. So
It's essentially the same model because in the Old Testament, the Hebrews wouldn't have had that many priests, I guess, right?
well, they had the high priestly caste, the sons of Aaron. Well, the Jews had the high priestly caste, the sons of Aaron, and then they had the Levites, and the Levites were a whole tribe that were not allocated lands, and they were not allocated, a living, essentially, but rather they made their living by, especially before the exile, because in every village there was a place of offering, and the Levites would offer sacrifice for everyone in the village on that village altar.
Didn't they also take turns to constantly have sort of like a shift work?
Exactly.
In the temple.
I think Saint Simeon. I think there was in the gospel it speaks of how it was his turn
Yep.
In
serve.
Kohen is the Hebrew word for priest. So that's translated today, the Jewish family name of Cohen, ostensibly can track their lineage back to the priesthood.
Mm-hmm. Or Levine.
Is that Levi?
Levite.
Levi.
Yeah. That's the French form of Levite. So there's continuity between the Old Testament priesthood and the New Testament priesthood.
Except our offering does not involve blood.
No, we offer Christ, and He offers Himself back to us. In the Old Testament, well, anyway, that I could go on and on for that. But in a relationship between the parish and the monastery, there's a big difference between how, in some ways, between how parish life is lived and how life in the world or life in a monastery. In other ways, things are exactly the same. The services that are prescribed are exactly the same. Parishes tend not to do as much of them, but the prescription is identical. In America, our church life is very low level, low key, very immature, profoundly immature, everywhere, and without exception. But you go to some of the ancient churches in the old world, and church life on one hand is completely recognizable. On the other hand, there's a greater intensity. So in the urban centers, everywhere in the old world, in the Orthodox world, Parish clergy are there full-time. Their basic job is the daily services, plus all the sacraments that people come for, and all the, the prayers and the Molyevins and panikitas and all of that kind of stuff, and the teaching and the catechesis and all of that stuff. So they're there, full-time, and, full daily cycle of services, and this is in parishes. We don't have that.
They don't have a house for the priest. The priest would live right next to the church.
Well, no, they have a house for them.
Right.
Yeah. Now, culturally, there's different ways our system has evolved because of our culture and the necessities in our culture. So if a priest is paid pennies and lives in the parish house, what happens when he retires?
Well,
So
I think I haven't heard about a priest retiring until I was here. I just didn't. Yeah, I mean.
yeah, well,
we actually call the priest Grandpa Pope. That's exactly what we call
yeah,
Grandpa Pope, because they just grow. They serve in the church until they can move, basically, and if they pass away or if something happens that they can't speak or they can't remember,
It's like old
then
soldiers, they
the
never
bishop
die.
will come and bring in a new priest.
right. But then what happens to Matushka? And that's a big issue.
I don't know.
That's a huge issue in some of these churches where
In our old culture, the kids, some of the kids will take mommy.
yeah, but what if they don't? What if there aren't kids?
Well, then they'll be chased out of the village.
Yeah, yeah, and it's horrible,
They're not
That's
gonna be
horrible.
able to live normal life.
right? So
That's unthinkable.
so the way things have evolved for us are different, because we want to make sure that a priest has, something to retire on, at least in the OCA, ROCOR is hopeless for the most part. Financially, it's just hopeless, but not completely actually. But you want to make sure a priest has something to retire on. That if the priest dies, that Matushka is not going to get thrown out into the street. There are places, and there are plenty of cases where Matushka gets thrown out into the street after her husband dies. That's bad. That's awful. And
What,
and-
I mean, the whole, if that happens, what does that speak of this community? I mean, what is the point of all the, gathering and,
How can they call themselves Christians?
exactly.
pouring over the
Exactly.
same things all
They
their life?
did like one of the abomination of abominations.
Right, exactly, and that's it. Or father gets too old to serve. So at least in our culture, we're thinking about these things. So in ROCOR we have a long way to go as a whole archdiocese. But
Well, a lot of Orthodox countries, I assume, are like Europe, where the government essentially pays.
but we're not socialist yet.
No, but I mean, we're in a unique situation in this country that other Orthodox countries maybe are not facing.
Or happens for 150
Well, when you
years.
say the government pays, that's not really,
Yeah.
that's not really anything that
So.
you can't really live on that.
Yeah. So, anyway, this has been a kind of a long parenthesis,
So,
but
It's a short chapter.
yeah, but you got the idea that there's a different structure in a monastery, and that what is demanded of people in monasteries is not always what's demanded of people living in the world, and people living in the world who are trying to live as monks should probably go to the monastery because it's not going to work. Your wife will put you out on the street or something, and so anyway, chapter 2, step 2. The man who really loves the Lord, who has made a real effort to find the coming kingdom, who has really begun to be troubled by his sins, who is really mindful of eternal torment and judgment, who really lives in fear of his own departure, will not love, care, or worry about money or possessions or parents or worldly glory or friends or brothers or anything at all on earth. But having shaken off all ties with earthly things, and having stripped himself of all his cares, having come to hate even his own flesh, and having stripped himself of everything, he will follow Christ without anxiety or hesitation, always looking heavenward and expecting help from there, according to the word of the holy man. My soul sticks close behind thee. Psalm 62. And according to the ever memorable author who said, I have not wearied of following thee, nor have I desired the day of rest of man, O Lord. And that's Jeremiah. So the kind of detachment, it's interesting in regards to detachment, because there is a kind of detachment that simply comes from the way of life. And it's not that you necessarily have to go through and say, I renounce and I detach from this. And no. But things drop away. They just drop away. And if you completely set your mind to following Christ and in the monastic life and the way that this book is leading, then all of these things are going to drop away, because if you're truly focusing on giving up all things, thank you, for the sake of Christ and the gospel, you've already made that decision. Everything orders itself accordingly. Chapter 2. After our call, which comes from God and not man, we have left all that is mentioned above, and it is a great disgrace for us to worry about anything that cannot help us in the hour of our need, that is to say, the hour of our death. For as the Lord said, this means looking back and not being fit for the kingdom of heaven. Knowing how fickle we novices are, and how easily we turn to the world through visiting or being with worldly people, when someone said to him, suffer me first to go and bury my father, our Lord replied, leave the dead to bury their own dead. In other words, when we make the decision to go according to this way of life and leave the world, we need to just leave it behind and not look back. 3. After our renunciation of the world, the demons suggest to us that we should envy those living in the world who are merciful and compassionate, and be sorry for ourselves as deprived of these virtues. The aim of our foes is by false humility, either to make us return to the world, or if we remain monks, to plunge us into despair. It is possible to belittle those living in the world out of conceit, and it is also possible to disparage them behind their backs in order to avoid despair and to obtain hope. It's fairly clear? In that previous paragraph, I think what's really important is to realize that one of the unmentioned currents underlying this is the identification of leaving the world for monastic life and martyrdom, and accepting martyrdom. Because if you accept martyrdom, you're dead to the world, right? You can't be caring for, possessions and relationships and, parents and children and so on and so forth, because you're dead. And you can't put those things before serving Christ if you're going to be a martyr. If you do, then you're not going to go be a martyr. And in monasticism, it's the same thing. You're dead to the world.
Pastor, I was just going to say on the verse, let the dead bury the dead, coming from a Protestant background and having discussions about that verse, it never made any sense. But even with the context that you provided about what it meant to be apostle and to stay in one place for 3 days, then you were no longer. And with the ascetic and the monastic perspective, it makes so much more sense.
Yeah. And it's also important to remember that, especially the time that this was written, very often monastic renunciation of the world coincided with baptism. People would put off being baptized until they could definitively renounce everything. And, not just and so, as for many of the great fathers, immediately after baptism, they entered the monastery so that they wouldn't sin. And what is baptism? It's dying and rising again. It's the sacrament of death and resurrection. And so the sense of, I think right now, what do we think of baptism? Either, cute little baby gets a bath in the middle of the church, right, with all this, or, and so the baby receives grace and the baby receives incorporated into the body of Christ, and it's not so much, you don't think about death there, unless you're the priest and you're afraid you're going to drown the little thing. Honestly. But it's a very important thing to understand that baptism is in our baptism we died to the world. Now, for those of us who have come in as adults, when we were baptized, the old man died. And all the relationships had to be reinterpreted in relation to this new central reality in our life. Because who I am before baptism and who I am after baptism, hence the new name and all of this, is totally different. Or it should be. The old man dies in the baptismal font, and the new man is resurrected in Christ. And that resurrection, that's the first resurrection. That's our first resurrection. Our second resurrection is at the last day. There are 2 deaths and 2 resurrections. Hopefully we avoid, and the death of our body doesn't count as the second death, because it's just a passing into the kingdom, and we're already living in that kingdom because we've already died to the world and are living the life of the kingdom through baptism. So the second death is not the death of the body. The second death is if we're cast into the lake of fire.
Therefore, the death of the body is merely the planting of the body.
Right.
So that it's resting there while we kind of wait around for it to become resurrected.
Right.
To rejoin us.
Exactly. So.
Was that understanding you spoke? You said how people will put off baptism until they're ready to completely leave the world, start a really new life. And I often remember reading about Ananias and Sapphira. What they did, they left a little. They didn't give completely everything away. They left a little bit for themselves, and that's what ended up costing them. And costing them their salvation.
Yeah.
And
And their
I
lives.
guess I'm always conflicted. How did it go from that kind of expectation for joining the church to what we have today? I mean,
Well, in the monastery, that's the expectation. When you join the monastery, you give up all your possessions. And in fact, the monastery, you don't even, and ultimately in the monastery, you don't even maintain you don't even have the same clothes. You don't even keep the clothes on your back. You get new clothes.
so
It's like boot camp.
Yeah. Well, it is actually. It is, and there's
Packed everything up the night you got there, way it went.
Yep. There's probably a relationship between that.
is there a particular time where this change has occurred? Because reading the book of Acts, that was apparently the expectation.
Well,
for everyone.
Ananias and Sapphira lied, I think they weren't required to give everything, but they said they did.
Okay.
They said they were.
And I think that was the big.
But actually, they were required to. At that point in the life of the church, they all lived in community and they shared everything. It started out as a communal movement, Lyman.
Okay, but the text doesn't necessarily say that they were required to do that.
Everything I've read indicates that was the expectation in those earliest years. You're talking about 2 or 3 years after Pentecost.
They were communal for a few years till they figured out that didn't work.
Right, exactly. And so monasticism, part of the ethos of monasticism is to go back to that ethos of the early church, where everybody lived in community. They lived as angels. In other words, the sons of the kingdom neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. And if you look in Luke in that passage, the tenses of the verbs are in the present, and not. It doesn't say, and they will be like angels in heaven. And it's not the sons of the kingdom will do this, but the sons of the kingdom do this. So it's then this is about that whole kind of radical renunciation and of the life of the world that went with being a member of the church in its earliest years.
Which you would kind of expect since that was
Yeah.
so close to Christ.
Right?
And they also thought that Christ was coming back imminently.
Immediately, yeah. So, yeah.
While we're still early in the book, I just kind of want to personally determine how to approach the book myself. Now, are we discussing this as a preferred method or the method some prefer?
This is the method some prefer.
Okay, that's because again, it makes a big difference, right?
Right. This course is not to say everybody should go join a monastery. We'll have a men's monastery over on this side, and we'll have a women's monastery over on this side, and a pit of crocodiles between them. Pacomian style. But that means the guys get all the little boys, which would be a plethora in this community. But rather, this is the ideal of monastic life, and it's important for us as Christians to understand what monastic life is. And there are those maybe who come and or who are listening to this on the who want to join monasteries, and so. But there's plenty of material in here that's absolutely universally applicable. Some of it's not. The same kind of, you can't expect the same kind of monastic renunciation and detachment of people in the world as you can for monks. It doesn't work like that. But when it comes to dealing with the passions, with the spiritual psychology. That's the same for everybody.
And it's inspiring for someone who's not a monastic to know how, or to have some sort of insight into how the monastic life is, especially as a man.
Or should be.
Or should be in this world, to say this is how they're doing it. Okay, they're an inspiration to.
Right.
That's
Even
huge.
with the detachment, there's up to a point that
Yeah.
applies to everyone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and we all have to have, detachment is nothing else than the proper ordering.
Yeah, like Father Alexander mentioned earlier, it's not that you don't love your family as much, but you should love God more.
Right, exactly.
Everything you have for your family is still there, but
Exactly.
you put them in God's hands too.
Mhm.
You're not the ultimate responsibility for them, He is. So.
Yeah.
I was reminded of George Ushak
Uh-huh.
with this question because he, how old is he? He's
18.
18, yeah, and he went to the monastery and he was ready to join like right away if they would let him, but they didn't. So go.
He's
Yeah.
being obedient to his spiritual father.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if it was the way, then they would have said sure.
Yeah. Well, he's in good shape actually. So anyway, how about verse 5 or chapter 4? Let us listen to what the Lord said to the young man who had fulfilled nearly all the commandments. One thing you lack: sell what you have and give to the poor, and become a beggar who receives alms from others.
Saint Nicholas.
Many thousands of saints over the
And
course of
he's always before my eye. I don't remember all of them, but that was to me was just the story up to the story, his life up to the story where he does the giving in the middle of the night. It, like at least I think in 2 places he's like a beggar on the street. even though his parents were rich, so they left him everything. He didn't give it up. He still had it. He still had it. He was giving it away all his life, and that was to me was really like a shocking image.
Yeah.
You have it, and you don't care about it.
Yep.
It's only valuable as much as you can give it away.
Yeah. And the other thing, another way to look at it is that we're stewards of our possessions.
Stewards, yes.
We don't own them, because if we think we own them, they own us. So, chapter 5. Having resolved to run our race with ardor and fervor, let us carefully consider carefully how the Lord gave judgment concerning all living in the world, speaking of even those who are alive as dead, when he said to someone, "Leave those in the world who are dead to bury the dead in body." His wealth did not in the least prevent the young man from being baptized. And so it is in vain that some say that the Lord commanded him to sell what he had for the sake of baptism. This is more than sufficient to give us the most firm assurance of the surpassing glory of our vow. It is worth investigating why those who live in the world and spend their life in vigils, fasts, labors, and hardships, when they withdraw from the world and begin the monastic life, as if at some trial or on the practicing ground, no longer continue the discipline of their former spurious and sham asceticism. I have seen how in the world they planted many different plants of the virtues, which were watered by vainglory, as by an underground sewage pipe, and were hoed by ostentation, and for manure were heaped with praise. But when transplanted to a desert soil, inaccessible to people of the world, and not so manured with the foul-smelling water of vanity, they withered at once. For water-loving plants are not such as to produce fruit in hard and arid training fields. This is good. And this is very important. It's very good and very important to follow a spiritual discipline. But if you're doing it for show and think that that makes you worthy of monasticism, and think that is a good preparation for monasticism, you've got another thing coming. Because truly it's watered as with an underground sewage pipe of vanity and pride, and that kind of fake asceticism doesn't last. You know, we used to have these young guys come to the monastery, and they'd be all pious, and they'd be all draped up with tchotchkes, and big cross. You'd think they were a priest, except they barely had two hairs coming out of their chin, and of course they looked really scruffy and smelled the same, and Mr. Pious, Mr. Orthodox, and then they wouldn't last a week. Because the real thing is a whole lot different than the sham or the forms. And this, the brothers used to get on my case at the monastery, because I would say, "Oh, so are we all dressed up now? Is it Halloween?" Halloween, 365 days a year, trick or treat. What are you supposed to be dressed up as? You also have to have a sense of humor, even if it's cutting. It's very important, that any asceticism be real, and that it be done in secret. The only person that knows about it is your spiritual father, and you don't go around all dressed up. The guy who's ordained a reader and decides to wear his cassock all the time, going to the store in his cassock, would only trim both hairs, once in a while. Yeah, okay. The man who has come to hate the world has escaped sorrow. But he who has an attachment to anything visible is not yet delivered from grief. For how is it possible not to be sad at the loss of something we love? We need to have great vigilance in all things, but we must give our whole attention to this above everything else. I have seen many people in the world who, by reason of cares, worries, occupations, and vigils, avoided the wild desires of the body. But after entering the monastic life, and in complete freedom from anxiety, they polluted themselves in a pitiful way by the disturbing demands of the body. Let us pay close attention to ourselves, so that we are not deceived into thinking that we are following the straight and narrow way, when in actual fact we are keeping to the wide and broad way. The following will show you what the narrow way means. Mortification of the stomach, all night standing, water in moderation, short rations of bread, the purifying draught of dishonor, sneers, derisions, insults, the cutting out of one's own will, patience in annoyances, unmurmuring endurance of scorn, disregard of insults, and the habit, when wronged, of bearing it sturdily, when slandered, of not being indignant, when humiliated, not to be angry, when condemned, to be humble. Blessed are they who follow the way that we have just described, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And indeed, in the monastic tonsure, one of the you voluntarily accept that you will be derided, slandered, insulted, rejected, and otherwise abused.
By whom?
Doesn't matter. Usually by the church. You laugh.
No, I'm not.
I know what you mean.
It's actually the closest to you can hurt you the most,
Yeah.
because they know what hurts you.
Yeah.
it's readily available, me right there.
But it's only through enduring all of that stuff and going through all of that stuff that you work out your salvation.
It's very applicable for everyone. I mean,
And that's totally appropriate for everyone.
Yeah.
But in monastic life, you get a lot of that. And go into a mall, all dressed up, as one friend would say, all dressed up like Mother Teresa. People look and they don't understand. And you'll get stupid kids shot out the window at you. And it takes getting used to. But that's the way, and that's the real struggle, to learn how to endure all of that stuff without it disturbing your peace, and without condemning those who are abusing you.
So it's not enough to just take and grind your teeth.
No. As Saint Silouan said, you have to love your enemies. And you love, because your love for your enemies shows how much you love God. And to the amount that you love your worst enemy, to that amount you love God. To the degree you love your worst enemy is the degree to which you love God. So, it's a big challenge. Chapter 9. No one will enter the heavenly bridal chamber wearing a crown unless he makes the first, the second, and third renunciation. I mean the renunciation of all business and people and parents, the cutting out of one's own will, and the third renunciation of the conceit which dogs obedience. Quote, come ye out from them and be separate, says the Lord, and touch not the unclean world. From 2 Corinthians. Who amongst them has ever worked any miracles? Who has raised the dead? Who has driven out devils? No one. All these are the victorious rewards of monks, rewards which the world cannot receive. And if it could, then what is the need of asceticism or solitude? After our renunciation, when the demons inflame our hearts by reminding us of our parents and brethren, then let us arm ourselves against them with prayer, and let us inflame ourselves with the remembrance of the eternal fire, so that by reminding ourselves of this, we may quench the untimely fire of the heart. 11. If anyone thinks he is without attachment to some object, but is grieved at its loss, then he is completely deceiving himself. 12. If young people who are prone to the desires of physical love and in luxurious ways wish to enter the monastic life, let them exercise themselves in all fasting and prayer, and persuade themselves to abstain from all luxury and vice, lest their last state be worse than the first. This harbor provides safety, but also exposes one to danger. Those who sail the spiritual seas know this, but it is a pitiful sight to behold those who have survived perils at sea, suffering shipwreck in harbor. This is the second step. Let those who run the race imitate not Lot's wife, but Lot himself, and flee. So, more questions? Discussion?
The part about the parents,
Mm-hmm.
the family, how much of that applies to non-monastic?
Well, I think one of the things that's very important is that we all have a filial responsibility for our parents. And especially in this day and age, when people are living longer and longer and longer. This was written about the year 600, and few and far between were those people who attained to 60 years old. And there were some, and some even into their 70s and 80s, but very few. So, and who could imagine in the year 600 having a family with 5 generations alive? There's a wonderful lady who comes to the liturgies in my home chapel. And she retired quite a number of years ago from the federal government, and she brought her mother. Now, Pasha is pushing 80, and her mother is 96. And her mother has seen her great-great-grandchildren. Can you imagine? Something like that was almost unthinkable when this was written. And actually, somebody said of Pasha and her mother, I thought Pasha was in her 50s and her mother maybe in her early 70s. And yet she was 96.
That reminds me of Joseph.
What's that?
I think Joseph also got that luxury
Mm-hmm.
of seeing his great-great-grandchildren
Yeah.
passed. Like
Yeah.
before he,
Yeah,
But that's how rare it is my point, because it's like,
very rare.
extreme, like that's like the only one time that I can remember off the top of my head that it's mentioned. That's
Well,
happening.
Well, it talks about it in early chapters of Genesis,
Right, but like.
but
is it
not
like
since then.
When people started living more normal spans of years, is it
Yeah.
like normal to us?
Right.
That's the only time I can think of it happening.
You mean after they started dying?
Yes. And after they started dying within, like, after it got down to like around 100 years or so.
I mean, you will surely die.
Right.
I mean,
Mhm.
so,
But no, I mean, like, how long they stayed alive was, they shortened down to like around 100, 130 years was the norm. Then it feels a lot more, that's like when it started becoming close to what we have today.
Yeah. So, these next few chapters are particularly monastic. In chapter 4 and 5, he starts getting into stories, and stories about people, and some of them are pretty neat. But the context is particularly monastic. So, and take from it what you can, but you can't expect, for example, to live in monastic style obedience while you're in a parish. Nor can you, as the father of a family, demand monastic style obedience from your family, right?
what about the extended family that is not interested in spiritual life or
Well, you love
hostile to?
Well, you love them, and you relate to them, and as you can.
You don't try to avoid it?
No. But the thing is, you keep your eyes on Christ, and Christ is the most important thing in your life, most important relationship in your life, right? And so everything takes its position in relation to that. And gradually, very often what happens is your brethren in Christ become closer to you than many of your own family, who are not maybe, and who have not ordered their lives like that. That doesn't mean that you hate them or you disregard them or you disown them or you don't relate to them, but you don't have much in common. As the old saying goes, you can't choose your relatives. So you do. But so what else? I want to try and keep things up to around 8:30. Is that good? Okay. So tomorrow night we have the Great Vespers with Liti.